I'd like to say that, first of all, that I sometimes think that this idea of India still having a chip on its shoulder, still being obsessed about foreign, is perhaps a bit like the lions you talked about in Africa. It's about as standard to say this nowadays as it is the old fallacies that all India's of fatalists and all those sort of standard statements. I remember in the old days when I was with the BBC and when politicians got angry with us, they used to say that the BBC is the foreign hand destabilizing India. And I used to say to them, if your country is so weak that the BBC can destabilize it, then you've got something to worry about. And I think that worrying about what foreigners say about India is really totally irrelevant to India as a whole, totally irrelevant to Indian literature.
And a certain friend of mine who lives in London but knows India well has written a book called The Flaws in the Jewel about British India and how it bungled and blundered and worked its way into empire, not intentionally, but just through it. It's published by HarperCollins here. Good plug for Roddy Matthews' book. It's called Flaws in the Jewel. And I was discussing that with him and discussing this question of whether Englishmen, he lives in London, should write about Indian history. And he pointed out that he was not writing about Indian history, he was writing about British history. He was writing about the history of the Brits in India. And I think that that remains true of whatever Patrick French writes, whatever William Dalrymple writes, for instance, right? And so I absolutely welcome the fact that anybody who has an acquaintance with a subject should, do that kind of work. And is completely entitled, and probably one will get a certain amount of enlightenment from the books that they write coming from their particular perspective. So I really do think that there ought to be, after 300 years of interaction, that literary interaction also. And that should continue for as long as people want to write about it.
Literary festivals, I don't think, have any real meaning, I think, in terms of the questions that we are talking about. I'll give you the example of Jaipur. I went there for a day. William Dalrymple called me for a drink. He still hasn't given me that drink, but that's a different matter altogether. And so I heard 3 sessions. The first was Getzi, I'm not sure what the pronunciation was, speaking. Large audience. Immediately afterwards, it was followed by a session on poetry by none other than Kapil Sibal.
What?
Yeah. I am not making this up. That's exactly what happened. That was followed by a discussion on Kashmir.
He also opens the bowling for India.
And if you're talking about removing the distinction between the critical and the popular, in this case, it's neither popular nor critical. It is the result of the literary incestuousness of this country, which we are not willing to name and talk about, the back scratching, the families that are encouraged, the little cliques that run this festival. I mean, I will name it. I have no problems. I think we need to say this. Kapil is related to Namita by marriage. I don't think there should be any other reason that he was there. That is a horrendous piece of work, that SMS nonsense that he has written there. And why don't we say these things honestly? We will never have a literary tradition if we can't speak about these things honestly. We don't.